and welcome to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's Pints and Politics. I'm Kevin Riley, the editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and I'd like to thank you for being with us and being a part of a little bit of history. We have never done this event virtually before. This is a first, and I can tell you it's going to be a lot of fun because you're going to get to do something I get to do all the time, which is to talk politics with three of the best reporters that we have on our staff. And you're going to get to meet them in a minute. We're going to go over a few logistics of how this will work in a minute. But I wanted to remind you that you can comment and ask questions on the Facebook comment section and the YouTube comment section if you're watching us in that way. And I also wanted to acknowledge all of you who are subscribers out there. Thank you. We could not do this kind of work and have this kind of event without you. So thanks very much. So let's get to meet these folks right away. First, I'm going to ask Greg to introduce himself. Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Greg Bluestein, coming to you live from the Dog Nation studios with this hat that says, wash your damn hands. It's the first time in the AJC building in a couple months, so it's great to be here filming this. But I've been with the AJC since 2012. I'm a lifelong Atlantan and went to UGA, and I've been covering politics for the AJC since about 2013.
Okay, next, Jim Galloway.
Well, thanks to all of you for being here. I'm Jim Galloway. I have been, I'm working on my fifth decade at the AJC. I grew up in Atlanta off Old National Highway. I'm a South Side boy. And I've been editor, reporter, the political columnist now. And it's been a very, very interesting political year.
Okay, next, Tia.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tia Mitchell, and I'm the AJC's Washington correspondent coming to you from the DC area. I've been an AJC reporter for about 2.5 years and about 7 months, so pretty recently became the Washington correspondent. Let's have some fun tonight.
Yeah, it's so good to see all three of you. I haven't actually seen you except on video in a long, long time. So I'm really looking forward to this, and I think I'll enjoy it. We'll all enjoy it, and certainly the folks tuning in will enjoy it. So a little bit about how we're going to do this and how we put it together, how we got some of the topics we're going to talk about. So we asked people for questions in advance, and boy, did we get them. And we've got over 700 people who RSVP'd to tune into this event. And as I said earlier, we're going to keep taking your questions on social media if you're watching on Facebook and YouTube. Tonight, we'll be talking about statewide and congressional races on the June 9th ballot and beyond. You know, we've got 2 Senate races to talk about, 4 really hot races for the U.S. House, 2 state Supreme Court races, which are way more interesting than they typically are. And so we're going to talk about that. And then, of course, we've got that little old race for president where Georgia is going to figure very prominently. So now, again, you submitted all these questions in advance, but what became clear to us is, wow, the coronavirus pandemic and how that might affect your ability to cast a ballot on June 9th, which is the primary, and then later in the November election, depending on how this thing goes on. That is absolutely at the top of everybody's mind. So I'm going to start with you, Jim Galloway. And this question comes from Anita Tucker. And I'm going to try to mention the people who ask the questions throughout as often as we can. And Anita's question is really straightforward, Jim. She wants to know, what impact is COVID-19 having on voters as far as who they'll vote for? And then in parentheses, she says, are there voters who will vote Democratic that usually vote Republican? And she probably means vice versa because this whole thing has gotten so strange.
Yeah, look, the pandemic has pretty much defined this primary, which you'll recall. First, we had the presidential primary in March that was postponed until May 19th with the regular primary. Then both of those primaries were postponed to June 9th. If you go back to 2016, and by the way, this is all being done now by mail. We've got something like 1.4 million people who have applied for ballots 600,000 have already cast a vote either by mail or in person. In 2016, we only had something like 890,000 ballots cast in that contest. So we're almost there at the top end. We will surpass that. But what's interesting, and to get to Anita's question, yes, it's a different kind of. You have people participating in this primary that have never participated in a primary before. As I said, the numbers are way high, and more tellingly, in 2016, 65% of the ballots cast were Republican ballots. All right, that has dropped 10 points. Democrats have it's now something like 40% Democrats and 45% Democrats and 55% Republicans. So yeah, it's changed the dynamic of the race, and I would presume that's going to affect the ballot top to bottom.
All right, so this one I'm going to come to Tia first, but Greg, you should jump right in once Tia finishes. And this question really comes, I think, for me, which is, I mean, what does this mean for President Trump in Georgia? Tia,
Yeah.
simple question.
I think that, a lot of people, and of course, President Trump really isn't on the ballot until November. And we don't know what our country will look like in November, because none of us expected it to look like it did in March and April. And there could be another wave. There could be a bad flu season. There could be a bad hurricane season. But I do think, if coronavirus comes back and affects the reopening that you guys in Georgia are seeing right now, that could really affect President Trump's support in November. And as a result, if President Trump is not doing well in November, the concern for Republicans is it will trickle down to other races on the ballot, those U.S. Senate races, which will both be on the ballot in November, the congressional races, which will all be on the ballot in November, and even down to state legislature. So a lot will be riding on not only how well President Trump is perceived as responding to coronavirus and anything else that happens, but if he is considered faltering or just not doing well, it could really have an impact in November.
Earlier this month, the AJC published 3 separate internal Republican polls that we got from Republican groups that were polling Georgia to gauge voter sentiment. They all showed different outcomes for the Senate races, but they all had one thing in common. That was a razor-tight race between Joe Biden and Donald Trump in Georgia. These are from Republican groups, not left-leaning groups, not media outlets, not independent groups. Republican groups are showing this. That was a giant wake-up call, I think, to Trump's campaign and to Washington groups that are closely watching this race, as well as to Georgia Republicans who have long been saying that 2018 was a wake-up call, and that if 2018 was so close that Georgia could really be in play. Now, of course, the pandemic's thrown everything up in the air. We don't have a large physical presence from Joe Biden's campaign here yet. We saw in 2016 how Hillary Clinton promised to compete in Georgia for the longest time and then never did, really, opened a campaign office shortly before the general election, but never forcefully campaigned here. Joe Biden's campaign is starting to rev up here. Stacey Abrams actually just announced an event for Joe Biden this coming Saturday, a virtual event, of course, but it remains to be seen if Democrats will actually compete here. But look, the polls show that Democrats could compete here, that it's competitive, and that Georgia could be in the crosshairs of Democrats really for the first time since '92. That was the last time that Georgia went blue in a presidential race.
So, Greg, just to follow up on the guy you spend so much time covering, the Governor Brian Kemp, he obviously doesn't have an election this fall, but he has a lot of interest in what happens in the election. So, first, an assessment of how all this could or would or is affecting him, and then what does he care about happening in November? I mean, what's key to him? And if his status isn't great because of the pandemic, where could he be hurt? Yeah,
well, look, I mean, his biggest priority, aside from President Trump, who is one of his biggest allies, is Kelly Loeffler, his handpicked Senate appointment, basically his chance to run on the same ballot, to pick a running mate for 2022, because if she wins in November, she'll also be on the ballot with him in 2022, running for a full 6-year term, is his top priority. And tomorrow they're having one of their first in-person events together since this pandemic started, as a sign of how important it is for Kemp's, for the governor and his campaign, that she does well in this. And this is a direct reflection of his political capital. And those polls I was just mentioning, at least one of them showed her with a giant deficit to Republican Congressman Doug Collins, her most formidable Republican adversary in the November special election. It was double digits. It was 20-something points, 30-something points among Republicans. So he is not on the ballot, but he might as well be with Kelly Loeffler, and he'll be putting a lot of his political capital behind her reelection chances in November.
Well, we're going to be coming back to some of the implications for Governor Kemp as we work our way through the Senate races and some of the conversation about the Georgia legislature as well. Jim, I'm going to come to you with this question that comes from Linda Javati, because I think it's relevant to your deep and long experience in the state. Is there any hope to regaining confidence in the CDC? Because of what's happened. I mean, they're of course an Atlanta-based outfit, important to us. Many of us probably know people who work there, and they sure have taken a beating in all of this. What's your, again, the political assessment of what that means?
Look, if we would be, if this were any other time in the past 30 or 40 years, we would have a reporter permanently stationed over the CDC at this point, because they would be the heart and soul of the response to the pandemic. They have been essentially sidelined by the White House. They are not permitted to go on camera without permission. Their guidelines have been watered down. I think, look, if you want to know how Joe Biden is going to campaign in Georgia, I think he's going to be pointing to the CDC and saying that I think they have 17,000 people working in Atlanta, and far more worldwide. But he's going to be pointing to the CDC as kind of the heart and soul of expertise on the coronavirus, and showing how they're being misused. So they are going to be playing a top role in this presidential campaign, whether they like it or not.
Some of you may hear that dog barking in the background. I have to apologize. That's my Irish setter, Mac. He's a big Jim Galloway fan, so when he hears Galloway's voice, he goes kind of crazy. My wife's trying to calm him down. But Tia, what about from the view from Washington on the CDC? I mean, you're in many ways you represent the Atlanta community there as one of the most important reporters from our state. What are people saying about the CDC, and can it recover?
Well, to me, the concern about the CDC and the concern tangent to that the president is not listening to public health experts, and he's more worried or more concerned about the politics and the partisanship, is a big concern in Washington. That in and of itself, though, is a byproduct of how hyper partisan DC politics are. It's almost, I know we say that, us reporters say that, those who are familiar with DC politics say that, but as someone who has been new and seeing it up close, it's really hard to even put into words how just about everything right now, this day and age, that happens in Washington is through a prism of Republicans versus Democrats. And unfortunately, that's what the CDC has been caught up in, as so many other things have been. And so I do think, of course, Democrats say this is a reason why they believe that Trump should be replaced, and that someone who has, in their opinion, more respect for public health and more respect for listening to experts should come in. But of course, there are Republicans who say that, no, of course, the CDC, there are Republicans who will say, we respect the CDC, we respect the experts, but at the end of the day, President Trump is who is in charge and he should have the final say. And there's just a philosophical difference a lot of times when it comes to who should have the final word. I don't think anyone would say the president is not at the top, but I think there are some, especially Democrats, who would say the president should be listening and deferring to the experts. And that's not necessarily what has happened all the time during the coronavirus pandemic.
So I'm going to turn to a couple other questions we have that people have sent us. And Greg, I'm coming your way on these. I'm going to combine two questions. One's from Tiffany Turner and one is from Chet McQuaid. And they're very pragmatic questions about voting. Will all the normal polling locations be open? And then how soon will primary results, including those absentee ballots, which so many people have turned to in early voting, be available and made public?
I came prepared. I asked Mark Nisi, our voting rights and elections expert at the AJC. If you don't follow him at Mark Nisi. Read every story he writes because he's covering this head to tail, every voting twist and turn we've got. But some election day precincts have closed, he said, especially churches and schools that are refusing to let anyone inside. So there's going to be a natural closing of some of these polling places that you're used to going to over the years. Check the state's My Voting page at www.mvp.sos.ga.gov. That's www.mvp.sos.ga.gov to find your precinct to make sure it hasn't closed. And as for the test result, the election results, we're not sure how long they'll take, but we already know that it probably won't be the typical. We will not know a lot of the results, or at least some of the more important results, the night of the election. That's going to be tough for us. Us reporters, we have different versions of stories pre-written. This person wins, this person wins. It's too close to call, whatever it might be. And usually we're used to, by the Wednesday, maybe Wednesday afternoon, having a clear result. Last year, the 2018 midterm between Stacey Abrams and Governor Kemp was the giant exception. We didn't have a real result for 10 or so days. But I think you could have a several-day lag with some of these closer races as elections workers scramble to count hundreds of thousands of absentee ballots. As Jim said earlier, some are already in. But we did an interview with Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger earlier this morning, who said they expect turnout to surpass 2 million votes, and the bulk of them will be absentee ballots, or at least a large proportion of them. So that is hundreds of thousands of absentee ballots that have to be counted by these elections officials. And some of them are they're all dealing with the same struggles we are. Some of them have contracted COVID. Some of them are older than 65 and subject to sort of stay-at-home orders. So a lot of the same struggles that we're all facing, of course, the county elections officials are facing as well.
Jim Galloway, I know that you've been around an awful lot of elections through all these years. What is your gut telling you about what this vote counting will be like? Let's just focus on the primary election for now.
Okay. Well. First of all, I think we can count on returns from Fulton County being slow. That's just a 40-year tradition. But to Greg's point, I was talking this afternoon with Gabriel Sterling, who's kind of in charge of statewide voting for the Secretary of State's office, and he's actually pretty confident that most races we're going to have results on by the end of Tuesday night, and he's saying that because the state election board has really relaxed a few rules on absentee ballots, and local counties 159 counties will begin counting and logging in those absentee ballots on June 1st, 8 days before the close of voting. So they'll be sequestered. Those votes will be sequestered. Nobody's going to be leaking out who's winning, who's not winning. But immediately, at 7:01 on Tuesday, we'll have those results, presumably. And then the one thing because this is all paper now, remember, this is all, so they have distributed some rapid scanning machines to all 159 counties, and they think that's going to speed the process as well. But again, look, this is a strange election in that it was supposed to be an election to test out touchscreen vote, a new generation of touchscreen voting machines. We got with we had people in the state capitol who busted their rear ends to get those machines in place. Then the coronavirus hits, and suddenly those are sidelined, and we have to shift to a vote by mail system. It's just an amazing logistical feat to get this vote in.
Yeah. Greg, I'm going to come back with a couple more of these questions. One of them kind of personal to me, and then Tia have something for you. But first, Greg, on this voting question, is Fulton County going to get all these absentee ballot requests done? I will tell you that I sent mine in almost as soon as I got it and still don't have it. And that question comes from Gail Dean, and one from Lydia Walker. What happens if I don't get that ballot? And I happen to have both of those questions personally. So I hope you talked to Mark long enough to be able to answer to those too.
Yeah. Well, the first one was it Gail's question, but regarding Fulton County, is it looks like the backlog has been cleared. Yesterday, the AJC reported that Fulton County elections officials said it was cleared, and that they were working through the final few thousand earlier this week, but it's been cleared. And today, the Fulton County election supervisor had a media conference where he said that if anyone is still having issues, to contact their office and to seek out information and provide your details, and they're going to work with you, work through those issues. So that's that. There's still going to be inevitable issues. Secondly, in regards to what if you didn't get it? I mean, you have several options. You can still vote in person. You just have to let them know that you want to cancel your absentee ballot request form. So you can still show up, or you can request another absentee ballot. I know it's confusing, but that is an option too. My gut would be just to go try to vote in person, or early or on election day, and just let the folks know there that you did fill out an absentee request form, but you want to cancel it.
And I think you can also check online too the
Yes.
status of your request. So
That
I would
website
advise. Yeah.
I read out earlier has all that information.
And we should probably also note, it's not just about getting your ballot in. If you're going to vote by mail, it's got to arrive by June 9th right now. Mark has talked about a lawsuit possibly trying to get that changed so it's a postmark date instead of an arrive by date. But as of right now, it has to be in the hands of your election office by June 9th. So if you think you're cutting it close, you either want to use a drop box in your county, which, each county, different counties have different places where you can drop it off instead of putting it through the mail. Or again, if you're cutting it close, you might want to do what Greg just suggested and say, hey, I'm just going to go ahead and vote in person and ask them to cancel the absentee ballot. But that's something that voters should keep in mind as well.
Okay, Tia, this question comes from Mabel Thomas. Does the pandemic favor the rich in terms of campaigning, social distancing, and no availability to go to the public because of 10 or fewer people gathering? The folks trying to buy the races are able to buy more TV and get exposure. I mean, sort of making a statement there, but really in the form of a question, right?
Yeah, and it's not so much the rich. The pandemic is benefiting incumbents who already have that built-in name recognition, that built-in familiarity with voters. So that's definitely a benefit. And the pandemic is benefiting those who have money to spend. That's not necessarily always the rich. Doug Collins has lots of money to spend on his Senate race, just like Kelly Loeffler does, because he's got some outside groups willing to give him some money. He can raise money and things like that. So yes, but in some ways, campaigning's a little cheaper this time around. You've got to be innovative. You're online, you're doing social media, which is why the reach and the name recognition helps. But you're not spending as much money on these fundraisers and these big, huge events that require, facilities and security and things like that. So, but again, really incumbents, especially if you're someone who's never run for office before and you're trying to unseat somebody who's really been around and voters are really familiar with, that's going to be difficult this year.
If I could jump in here, we forget that politics is it's a baby kissing experience. It's handshakes. It is touching and feeling. And if you're introducing yourself to voters, you want to be able to just kind of look them in the eye. And instead you're having to run a by. We're voting by mail, but they're running their campaigns by mail. We're getting, I'm getting a mailbox full of flyers every day.
Yeah, it's certainly an unusual time. So what I want to do now is shift our conversation into some of the specific races. We talked a lot about the pandemic. Sorry I didn't get to every question, but I know you're all interested in some additional topics. And Jim, I'm going to come to you on this. We have 2 Senate races. It's kind of confusing to understand exactly what's going on here. So take us to school and explain what's going on, and as a voter, what we need to be ready for when.
Okay, all right. Let's call the David Perdue seat Senate race number 1. Okay, Senate race number 1 is the traditional re-election campaign. Perdue was elected first in 2014. He replaced Saxby Chambliss. He comes up for a re-election in 2020. We have a traditional Democratic primary that is booked for June 9 that will determine who challenges Perdue. We have in that race we have John Ossoff, who ran against Karen Handel, as we mentioned. We have Theresa Tomlinson, the former mayor of Columbus, and we have Sarah Riggs Amico, a businesswoman who was the party's lieutenant governor nominee. More than likely, that race is going to go into an August 11 runoff. That's just my guess. Okay, all right, that's Senate race number 1. Senate race number 2. This gets a little complicated. Okay, Johnny Isakson announced last September that he was going to retire before the end of his term, which is in 2022. Okay, Kelly Loeffler is appointed by Governor Brian Kemp to replace him until the next general election vote, and this is a race for the final 2 years of Isakson's term, and it is a special election, i.e., it is a nonpartisan election. It has been called a jungle primary. I prefer to call it an all-comers primary. You will have Democrats on that ballot with her. You will have Republicans, and you will have independents. Right now, I think it's a field of 21 candidates. 21. And what that means is, yeah, there's going to be a runoff. I should go back to Senate race number 1. There is a Libertarian in that race as well. And so what this means is, if President Trump really affects the Georgia vote, and if no Republican in either of those races clears 50%, and in Senate race number 2, that's highly unlikely, we move to a January 5th runoff. We could have 2 Georgia U.S. Senate races determine control of the U.S. Senate on January 5th. And that is going to be, that would be a show.
Well, thanks, Jim. Now, Tia, you cover both of these incumbent Republican senators. And before we sent you to Washington, this all looked perfectly predictable, which we would have 2 more Republicans, whoever they might be, and Georgia would have Republican senators, as we've had. But for some reason, since you went to Washington, everything got way more interesting. But what are you hearing? I mean, have the Democrats obviously would like to get both seats. They certainly want to get one. There's talk of both of those things, but do they have a real chance? And particularly in Perdue's race, and this question comes from Laura Driscoll, I mean, what's the Democratic strategy there? I mean, how could they beat Perdue if they want to beat him? Because he seems set. I mean, he seems firmly in place.
I think, coming into this, we all thought, Kelly Loeffler being a novice and, that seat is somewhat of an open seat, a little bit more vulnerable. And then Doug Collins deciding to run against Kelly Loeffler makes that a whole different race, that Senate race number 2. In Senate race number 1, Perdue, again, having the power of the incumbency, is considered, a front runner. However, I think that if, Republicans don't like hearing this, but at the end of the day, Stacey Abrams did show that you cannot count a Democrat with a well-run campaign out, because she did not win, but she came close enough that, it's within striking distance for any Democrat that gets their act together. That being said, you've got 3 leading Democrats, as Galloway has talked about, and it's really, I think the strategy is going to depend on which candidate wins. Each of those 3 leading Democrats has different pluses and minuses up against Perdue. If one of the women win, that's a different race against Perdue than if Ossoff wins. But Ossoff has that, young progressive thing going on. So that's a different race he could run against Perdue. A lot of people have said, well, we're not hearing much from the Democrats in the Loeffler race, that special election. And that's because, again, that election is still many months away. And so you've got Lieberman, Warnock, Pastor Warnock has the endorsement. And then you also have Ed Tarver, the former, was he the district attorney? I believe, federal prosecutor. Right. So, it seems that Warnock is kind of the leading Democratic candidate, but Lieberman has been saying, if you look at the polling and you look at my money, don't count me out. So again, a Lieberman as the leading Democrat in that race is a different way to contrast Loeffler and Collins than a Warnock would be. So I think, at the end of the day, it's hard to really handicap which Democrats can win, because the Democrats are still sorting it out as to who that nominee will be, particularly in the Perdue race.
So, Greg, one of the really interesting things about the Loeffler thing, which we've all referred to, is Representative Doug Collins. He made clear that he wanted Governor Kemp to appoint him. He had an extremely high profile during the period leading up to that as the president's main defender on the U.S. House Judiciary Committee. You know him and, have spent time with him. What can you tell people about why he's made this decision that's, really created some dissension and difficulty within the Republican Party?
Yeah, remember when impeachment was all we talked about, not the pandemic? It seems like so long ago. It was just a few months ago. But he was President Trump's lead defender in the House Judiciary Committee during the impeachment process. He was the guy, as you mentioned, Kevin, who lobbied aggressively with Governor Kemp to appoint him. Within hours of Senator Isaacson's announcement that he was stepping down, I did an initial story saying, here's who could run. And I immediately heard from his office, from his aides, saying, hey, make sure you mention Congressman Collins. And in that same story, I also mentioned Kelly Loeffler, only because she happened to be at the same event I was at. And I was like, maybe she floated running for Senate way back in 2014. Maybe she'll be interested in this as well. But Congressman Collins made a very aggressive pitch. He was one of the first people to turn in his resume to Governor Kemp's online application process. And he had a very important ally. That was President Trump, who 3 different occasions pushed Governor Kemp to tap Collins to the seat. And Governor Kemp defied the president and picked Kelly Loeffler, in part because he felt like she could help appeal to suburban women who have steadily fled the Republican Party, and in part because she promised to spend $20 million at least on the race, which is an unheard of sum in Georgia politics. So Doug Collins said, I granted that, and he never stopped running for office. I mean, the moment that Kelly Loeffler was appointed, within minutes of the governor's announcement that Kelly Loeffler would be the pick, Doug Collins sends out a press release saying, hey, I'm still thinking about this race. Just want to let you know. And within weeks, he was in the race too. So it's made it very complicated for Kelly Loeffler. And we're seeing with the stock transaction that Tia has been reporting on, instead of a circling of the wagons type effect where Republicans all band together and say this is a dirty Democratic trick, you've got Democrats and Republicans both cornering Kelly Loeffler over her stock transactions because of Doug Collins, because he's been leading sort of the calls for her to resign and step down.
Yeah, well, Jim Galloway, this gives me a chance to ask you a question that we've gotten live on Facebook from Niles Francis in Atlanta, and she wants to know whether Republicans,
the Wonder Canes,
the Wonder Team,
are discussing whether Republicans are discussing Loeffler's viability as a candidate. Would they really turn on her?
Oh, well, you have plenty of people in Doug Collins' camp that are trying to make that so. Yeah, they're trying to raise all sorts of questions. First of all, of course, we did have the recent announcement from the FBI that both Loeffler and Dianne Feinstein, the Democrat over from San Francisco, have been given clean bills of health on their transactions. But legality really was never an issue in this. It was the matter of you had a sitting U.S. senator who was able to kind of change their portfolio at a time when maybe a lot of other people couldn't do that. What I find very interesting, and this just builds on what Greg is saying, is that a governor is a very, very powerful individual in Georgia. I mean, he's got more executive power than just about any other governor in the U.S. And you don't cross governors all that often in Georgia. But with this contest, we've got something it's very, very different happening. You've got U.S. Representative Drew Ferguson splitting with him. Karen Handel, whose race against Lucy McBath depends on the votes of Republican women in the 6th district. She has endorsed Doug Collins. And I was talking to somebody, one of the GOP operatives that's working a 9th district congressional campaign to fill Doug Collins's seat, and she, and this person made the point that if you're a candidate for that office, if you're running for Doug Collins' seat, you're not going to endorse Kelly Loeffler. And the same thing is happening on the Republican side in the 7th district and often in the 14th. It's a very, very interesting phenomenon here.
Yeah, we're going to get to some of those too. I'm going to ask one last question of Tia, I think, here in the about the Democrats in the Purdue race, and this comes from Demetrius, and I hope I can say this name right, Masakufa. And his question is this: Tomlinson's ads say she has raised more campaign contributions in state than her opponents, which suggests that Ossoff is getting his money from out of state, as happened, I think, when he ran for Congress. Any way to review respective filings and confirm or debunk that statement? I know we will report on this over time, but, not only answer that, but what does that tell us about how they'll approach the race?
Right. And I mean, first of all, you can go on fec.gov. That's the Federal Election Commission.gov, fec.gov. And you can look up Ossoff's fundraising. You can look up Theresa Tomlinson's fundraising. We have not done the crunching in that way. We at the AJC have reported total fundraising. And but I don't Ossoff has not refuted what Tomlinson has said. And yes, that is one indication that Tomlinson is getting more support from Georgia thus far than Ossoff, if her numbers are correct, and we have no reason to believe they aren't. That is one indicator. But again, U.S. Senate is, yes, it's a Georgia seat, but of course there is national interest. So the fact that Ossoff has been able to attract some of those individuals around the nation with an interest of, building a Democratic majority in the U.S. Senate, getting more Democratic senators, that's also an indication of his viability. So I don't think one is more viable than the, both are good indicators, both tell you something, but it's not to say that it makes you a better or a worse candidate. Of course, the candidate, they're gonna celebrate what they can celebrate. So of course, for Tomlinson, she's going to celebrate that she's getting more money from the state. But money is still just one indicator. Just because you've raised the most money doesn't mean you're going to win. That gives you a little bit more money to spend on campaigning, but fundraising alone cannot make or break who wins that Democratic primary.
And no one knows that better than John Ossoff, who raised $32 million in that 2017 special election campaign for the 6th District of Georgia. When it comes to out-of-state and in-state donations, what's also more complicated is that they're counting itemized donations. Those are reportable donations over, I think, $200 is the benchmark. So it's not counting the small dollar donations, 5, 10, a lot of those donations that come in sometimes as small amounts as $1 at a time. And so what Ossoff's campaign is saying is essentially that it doesn't reflect his entire donation hoard. But Tia's right. Endorsements matter. We're not sure how much they matter, but they matter. Getting on TV, getting on air matters. It might matter more now during the pandemic because more people are stuck at home watching TV. These are campaigns that all promise to build grassroots armies to canvass neighborhoods. And now you can't do that. So we're not sure how that will play into it.
And remember that Stacey Abrams kind of changed the formula on this. It did used to be the fact that if you raised money from outside Georgia, you were looked down upon. She's changed that. She's changed it by establishing a national network, and kind of Ossoff kind of preceded her in that. So I just don't think the taint of outside money, outside Georgia money, is what it used to be.
Well, that gives me a chance to shift our questioning into another theme, which we got a lot of questions about, and it really is the balance of power in Georgia. We had so many questions about whether Georgia will turn blue, whether that's even possible in the presidential contest, and also, what that could mean at the state capitol. So, Greg, I'm gonna come to you on this. I mean, you mentioned the suburbs and Kelly Loeffler and the Republicans there, but what's going on out there, and what could happen? I mean, and how is each party seeing it is really a part of this too, right?
Yeah, I mean, the suburbs are Georgia's biggest battleground. And that John Ossoff race in 2017, that special election, was the first, loud, ringing reminder of that. This was a seat that Tom Price had easily held in 2016. I think he won by 21 points. And Ossoff lost, but he lost by about 4 points to Karen Handel in the most competitive special election we've seen here in a very long time. National attention. It was looked at as a referendum on President Trump's election in the suburbs. And then in 2018, you had counties that Trump, we weren't sure if it was a fluke or fleeting or what, but Trump lost Gwinnett County and lost Cobb County. Republicans lost those two counties for the first time in decades since Jimmy Carter's presidency. Well, Stacey Abrams improved on Hillary Clinton's margins in those two counties. I mean, made Gwinnett County and Cobb County clear Democratic wins. And you saw about a dozen state legislative seats across the northern Atlanta suburbs flip as well. And, of course, Lucy McBath defeats Karen Handel, winning Democrats their crown jewel of the 2018 election cycle. They lost the governor's race in every statewide election, but that was their biggest race they did win. And so 2020, the battleground will return to the Atlanta suburbs. That is where Democrats are hoping to consolidate their gains, and Republicans, as you saw with Kelly Loeffler's pick, hope that they can appeal to more women who have left the party over the last few years, whether it be because of Republican policies, whether it be because of President Trump, whether it just be because, an influx of newcomers are moving to the suburbs. Republicans have yet to figure out the formula. They're still winning, but their margins are much, much closer than they're comfortable with. And you saw it in 2016. It goes from President Trump wins the state by 5 points, and Brian Kemp wins the state by 1.5 points 2 years later.
Kevin, you could say on this topic, you could say that the absolute most important race in Georgia on November 3rd won't be the presidential contest. It won't be the U.S. Senate, those two U.S. Senate races. It will be the fight for control of the state house, for the Georgia House. Democrats need 16 votes to take control. If they can even come close, they kind of win a seat at the table when it comes to the 2021 redistricting, which will draw the political boundaries for the state and will determine that truly will determine the balance of power in Georgia
over the next decade.
Okay, we're going to come back to some of that State House conversation as well. Tia, here's one just as our person in Washington. I mean, how does Georgia rank? Is it truly a battleground state in 2020? What's the perception, and how important will it be? Will the money and efforts of the parties come here? Do they believe that it is a battleground?
So Georgia is definitely a state that is turning purple. I still consider Georgia a lean red state. It's still hard for Democrats to win statewide. Again, though, Stacey Abrams has shown that you can get within striking distance. So we can't count out any Democrat running statewide at this point. There are national groups that are invested. For example, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee is backing Warnock for that number 2 Senate seat, the Loeffler seat. They will get behind whoever wins that Democratic primary, the June 9th primary for the Purdue seat. The Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, which is a national body that's part of the Democratic Party nationally, is invested in flipping Georgia's House, as Galloway just mentioned. So there are, the National Democratic Party is investing its resources in trying to get more Democrats elected in Georgia, in trying to take control of the state house. And of course, they'll be invested heavily in that, that Congressional District 7 seat that is now open. Rob Woodall narrowly won against Carolyn Bordeaux 2 years ago, and she's back. And Woodall said, listen, I'm out. I'm not trying this again. So, of course, there are Republicans who are hoping to keep that seat red. But now it's an open seat and Democrats could win. It's another one of those suburban Atlanta districts that's becoming more blue. I think in the national scheme of things, when there's a national map and they shade it, is Georgia at the top of the list, with Florida and Ohio and Pennsylvania? Not yet. But I would say Georgia's like that next tier of like anything's possible. Kentucky, my home state, has a Democratic governor. Anything is possible, even in these states that historically have been considered, red or leaning Republican states.
Tia, I forgot to mention that question came from Ed Abisher. I think I'm saying that name right. So, Ed, thank you for that. Sorry for not saying that on the front end. Jim, you mentioned the Georgia House and some legislative races. So I'm going to throw this one at you because we don't have as much time. I want to get to some of the congressional races, but give us a House race that you think people should pay attention to, that you think is a very telling one. I know you've talked to me about District 71, I think it is, but what it's hard to track all these races, but give us one that will tell us what we need to do.
Okay. Let's go to House District 71. It's a Coweta-based seat with a smidgen of Fayette County. It was won in a special election by Philip Singleton, a very hard right kind of guy. He's not friends with House Speaker David Ralston. He has kind of joined the interior Republican opposition to Ralston. Losing him in that special election was Marcy Westmoreland Sackerson. She's the daughter of Lynn Westmoreland, the former Georgia congressman. She is kind of more toward the center. She is where Republicans would like to have their party be in order to preserve their majority. So that's on June 9th. That's a one-on-one race. That's not going to go into a runoff. That's what I'm watching, and specifically, I'm going to be watching to see how Republicans who vote by mail respond to that contest. Where do you get a more moderate electorate that way?
Okay, thanks, Jim. We're going to move on to Congress because we've got 4 highly competitive races for U.S. House. I don't know how much time we'll be able to spend on this, but the 6th and 7th in North Metro Atlanta, the 9th in Northeast Georgia, and the 14th in Northwest Georgia. But they'll probably all be likely to result in runoffs. But we get this question from Tom Spigolin, and I'm going to toss it to you, Tia. What will it take for Lucy McBath to retain her seat?
I think Lucy McBath is in the driver's seat. Number one, she has the power of the incumbency coming in. Her platform continues to resonate. think about it, she runs on a unapologetic platform of being the mother of a teenage boy who was killed in a senseless death. And unfortunately, those things have been happening recently, right before the election. And she has never shied away with it. Even when people tried to paint her as like a one issue candidate, she'll say, I care about other issues, but I am the mother of a son who was killed. And, we've got Ahmaud Arbery right in our state. And then there have been two others that have gained national prominence just over the last couple of weeks. So I think her message will continue to resonate. And Karen Handel will give her a run for her money. Of course, that'll be in November, and we're not sure what the political climate will be then. But I think that we haven't even seen as many of the big national groups coming in yet for Karen Handel. So it depends on how much money the Republicans throw into the race. If we find that Republicans, like the National Republican Congressional Committee, if they don't start throwing in money for Karen Handel, to me, that'll be an indication that the numbers aren't looking good for unseating McBath. And but I think she is, as the incumbent, is in the driver's seat.
Okay, so let's talk about the 9th district a little bit, and I'm going to ask you to jump in here, Greg. This question comes from Jim Mack. Have you heard any actual policy positions from the 9th District congressional Republican candidates? Their mailers all contain the same qualifications: pro-Trump, Christian, conservative, pro-Second Amendment, but no actual policy. I mean, I think embedded in Jim's question there is, why do candidates do this? But what's your take on what's going on there in the 9th?
I can help Jim with that. But both the 9th and 14th districts, we just talked about the 6th and 7th. Those are suburban districts, that really tight, close, competitive races where you're seeing the Republicans and Democrats take positions to their party's flank. Well, in the 9th and 14th, you've got some of the more, those are two of the most Republican conservative districts in the Eastern Seaboard. I mean, those are the two most heavily Republican districts in Georgia. They are bastions of conservatism. So when you see those candidates running for both those seats, they're running to their party's right flank as fast as they can. You've got, gun shop owners, and there was a debate with one of the candidates had, guns in the backdrop of her virtual Zoom. I mean, you have flyers about how trying to out anti-abortion each other. Who's the strongest opponent of abortion? And as they say, pro-life. So you see those candidates running to the party's base because that is the electorate there. Now, Democrats are running in the 9th and 14th districts too, but these are districts that Trump won by giant amounts and giant proportions, and so that's the sort of campaign strategy. They have to do that. In the runoff, you'll see a little bit more policy. You'll see a little bit more efforts to distinguish candidates from each other. But right now, in the absence of much hard polling too, and there's a lot of internal polls that fly around, but the absence of a lot of public polling that a lot of people can rely on, the favorites are the people with elected experience or name recognition, right? So that's why you're seeing State Representative Kevin Tanner and Matt Gertler and Paul Brown, the former congressman, get their names out there. And then Marjorie Taylor Greene in the 14th district, because she spent a lot of her own money on that race. And so that's what's helping to define those races this early. But I would say you're going to hear a little bit more about policy. But right now, it's really a race to attract the party's most fervent supporters.
Okay, I'm going to throw this next one to you, Jim Galloway, as we shift, and it's not an easy one, so we're going to need all the expertise you bring to the table. Please explain what's going on with the race. Well, what were races, but now just race for the Supreme Court.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, we'll start. We were supposed to have three. We were supposed to have three races for Supreme Court. We are down to two, but the story. We have both two appointees by Governor Deal are running for full terms. Sarah Warren and Charlie Bethel. Charlie Bethel is a former state senator. Okay, Sarah Warren is being opposed by Hal Meroz, and Bethel is being opposed by former state rep Beth Beskin from Atlanta. All right. this is where it gets. Let's focus on the Bethel Beskin race, okay? Because Beskin is a very interesting person. She kind of demonstrates how Georgia court races, what's happened to them, okay? She originally intended to run for the seat being given up by Robert Benham, the first African American to win a seat on the state Supreme Court. He was going to serve out the full term, retire at December 31st this year. He decided not to. He retired in March. That gave the appointment to the governor. So the governor was able to fill that seat. So Beskin was out of luck. All right. Then you had another one. You had Keith Blackwell. He sent a letter to the governor in February saying, I'm going to resign way over here on November 18th. After the November 3rd, after the contest for that seat. Beskin and John Barrow, the former Georgia congressman, both wanted to run for that seat. But the governor claimed it. Both of them went to court. The case went up to the Supreme Court, and 2 weeks ago or so, the Supreme Court decided that this future resignation amounted to a current resignation, and so the race goes poof, it disappears. Okay, so Beskin is now running against Charlie Bethel. It's very rare. We have yet to have a state Supreme Court justice defeated in an election, an incumbent. That just doesn't happen. But it tells you that it may not be that way on paper, but Georgia is shifting to a judiciary by appointment rather than the judiciary by election that's called for in the Constitution. I hope that makes sense.
Well, it's a tough one, Jim. Thanks for taking the time to explain that and for actually doing all the work that it takes to understand it. We're coming down to just having a few minutes left. And so what I was going to do here with a really challenging topic is the Ahmaud Arbery case. It really would not be a good idea to not talk about how on February 23rd he was killed, and now we have a father, son, and another man charged in that case. And the question really is going to come from Angel Harmon. And it has to do with hate legislation in Georgia and how that has come up now. So for each of you, and I guess we'll start with Tia, talk about the implications of that case for Georgia politics and, dive into the hate crimes legislation concept. And then I'll come to you, Greg, and we'll let Jim have the last word on whether that legislation will ever happen and what it would take for it to happen. So Tia.
Well, it was interesting, and I think Greg and I have both been writing about how, this case, unlike some of the others that did become more partisan, this one was almost universal in folks saying this isn't right and something should be done about it. And so that was a big difference with the Ahmaud Arbery case. There is, you've got the House has already passed hate crime legislation, but now there's real political pressure from business groups, law enforcement groups on the state Senate to pass a hate crime bill. And that's a different energy than perhaps other controversial shootings, particularly of Black men who didn't appear to be actively a threat at the time they were killed. So it does seem like there's a likely chance that a hate crime bill will be passed in Georgia.
Okay, Greg.
Yeah, take you back. Georgia had a hate crimes legislation back in 2000, and it was struck down as unconstitutionally vague by the state Supreme Court 4 years later. And since then, Democrats and some Republicans have been pushing for a revival. And last year, it narrowly passed the Georgia House, including the hate crimes law that included protections for sexual orientation crimes against people based on sexual orientation, which was a major deal. It got bottled up in the state Senate. There was some talk, but not a lot of talk about it earlier this year. But unfortunately, it's unfortunate that it took a slaying, but after Ahmaud Arbery's death, it revived talk about hate crimes legislation. You saw almost immediately the House Speaker David Ralston call on the Senate to take swift and sudden action to pass the legislation. And then just today, two of the state's most prominent business groups, the Metro Atlanta Chamber and the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, both came out and called on the Senate to pass a hate crimes bill as well. We're not sure what will happen to the Senate. I mean, just because there's momentum behind something, and just because it seems like a sort of a common sense thing that a big block of voters would support, doesn't mean it's going to actually get the traction to pass. And already you're hearing from some state senators saying they're concerned about the implications of it, that it's uneven justice, and that it could infringe on free speech rights and other things like that. So we're getting some indication that it could step back. But look, the other thing we have to keep in mind is the advocates pushing for hate crimes law, a lot of them, especially you talk to lawmakers in the House Democratic African American Black Caucus, they want it. That's just the start. I mean, they're pushing for vaster, broader changes to the justice system that they say have been languishing for years. More police accountability, more transparency in the court system, the abolition of mandatory minimum sentences. And you're seeing that sort of seep into some of the federal races too. I mean, just before we went on air, John Ossoff released a campaign ad that invoked Ahmaud Arbery's death and talked about his push for federal criminal justice. So you're seeing it shape federal races as well.
Jim Galloway, you've covered the state these many decades. I mean, what's going to happen here, or what would it take, for something to happen?
I think odds are pretty good for this bill. Okay, this is House Bill 426, by the way. It's sponsored by Chuck F. Strachan, a Republican from Tacula up in Gwinnett County. He's a former prosecutor. It passed by 6 votes last year in the House. And Greg's right. Yeah, David Ralston, after this, the Ahmaud Arbery slaying, he said this bill's got to pass. It has not even received a hearing in the state Senate. The chairman of the Judiciary Committee had expressed extreme misgivings on it. But there are 2 things that are important here. Number one, the legislature, the hurry up kind of finishing up of the 2020 legislative session will occur after the June 9th primary. And so you will have Republican senators who are not exposed to any fear of a challenge from the right should they support this bill. And moreover, Georgia politics are moving away from Georgia used to be governed through the prism of a Republican primary. That's changing. The real race is now in November 3rd. It's a general election race. And a Republican might be very smart to support this kind of legislation. The second part of this is this vote will happen, or this push is coming in the middle of a pandemic-induced economic downturn, and you've got some serious worries on the Georgia coast about tourism being affected, and if that means the state's reputation is at stake, and this hate crimes bill goes directly to the state's reputation. And I think that's why you're seeing the Metro Chamber get behind this bill, and that's why the Georgia Chamber, more importantly, Georgia Chamber is much more powerful than that because it's got a statewide reach. So I'm slightly optimistic that this bill has a future.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Jim. And I'm sorry to tell everyone we are out of time. I certainly hope you've enjoyed talking with these folks as much as I have, and hopefully we'll get to do it again soon. Thank you so much for joining us for the AJC's first ever virtual Pints and Politics. And to our subscribers, thank you. We could not do this without your support, and we hope to do a lot more of it. So thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.